My name's Adam House and I'm a fraud. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us for episode 3 of this podcast, Fraud, where I talk to people that I think are doing amazing things in the development and cultural build space and ask them if they've ever felt like a fraud, and if so, how they got past it. This week's guest, I'm delighted to say, is Helen Marshall. Now, you may know Helen Marshall the same way I first got to know Helen Marshall, through the incredible podcast Diary of a CLO. If you haven't checked it out, I'd say check it out. It's such a diverse list of guests and some really interesting conversations. Always gets me thinking. Also, she's the CLO of Thrive, which are a great company that are doing amazing things in a space that has been cause for fraudulent claims in the past. And Thrive are really doing their best to be open, honest, and direct about how they can help people in learning management. And also, she's done amazing work in trying to represent, bring together, and elevate the voices of women in the L&D space with her Women In program, which is still open. I suggest everybody goes to have a look at how they can help with that. I'll be back at the end to talk about all of the interesting points that Helen discussed through this. It was a great conversation, and it leads me to just ask, Helen Marshall, are you a fraud?
Starting off with the small questions there, Adam. Yeah, I mean, no, firstly, but also I think there's a broader conversation, which obviously we'll dig into as we go through the conversation around the feeling of being a fraud that sometimes you encounter on within your work and your practices that relate to imposter syndrome. So I think the answer that from the outside that people would give you would be no, and but sometimes I would probably struggle to say no, and might actually on a certain day say, yeah, actually I think I am. So yeah, really interested to see what we covered today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the reason, because as you've just said, the reason that I reached out to you and I really wanted to have this conversation with you is you are one of those people that, from not knowing you personally, but knowing the work that you do in so many different ways with Thrive and with your podcast, Diary of a CLO, and also the Women In thing that I want to talk about as well. From the outside looking in, you seem like the least fraudulent person out there. You seem to be like smashing it out of the park. But knowing myself that when I've done things that have gone down well to others, how much I've still felt like, am I supposed to be here and should I be doing this? I was really interested to know more about your story, and basically in those moments, have you ever felt like you aren't meant to be where you are, and how have you got past that to where you are now? So it'd be great to kind of get a quick history of where it is you've come from to being a CLO of Thrive and podcaster and woman supporter in our industry.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you pick up on that perception of me, because I think now, and especially over the past couple of years, and probably whilst working for Thrive, I feel like I've really kind of settled into my groove of kind of knowing what I'm doing. There's obviously still times when I feel like, oh, actually, what I should be doing more, or could I be doing things differently? But I've definitely settled into a bit more of a groove. And I think if you'd asked me the same question maybe 6 years ago, I would have approached it very differently, because and I think this is the same for quite a lot of people who enter the L&D space, who've entered it without formal qualifications a lot of the time. So when I first started, I mean, this is going back over a decade now, but when I first entered the industry, I kind of fell into it accidentally, as a lot of people do. I had been on track to complete a PhD and become a lecturer. That was kind of my goal. I'd done a bachelor's, a master's, and I started a PhD.
Right.
About a year and a half into it, and thought, I'm actually not sure what I'm doing here. Like, I don't think I want to be a lecturer, which was really in my head the only thing that I was doing it for. And you know what? There was a lot of imposter syndrome around that existed around that as well. From a research perspective, I was doing art history, which is quite a subjective field to
Right.
be um, doing a PhD in. And I was
Yeah.
really struggling with every time I suggested a certain way of looking or thinking or feeling about certain pieces of art that I was focused on, there was always someone to say, well, that's just ridiculous. Like, why are you looking at it like that? You should be looking at it like this instead. And I really
Right.
struggled at the time around the kind of the confidence to push back on those and really kind of and I guess the pushback from the other side of the conversation was often coming from people who were a lot more experienced than I was, and I was kind of just a PhD student, and I really didn't have that kind of confidence in the way that I do now
Mm.
to push back enough on the ideas. So I think if I actually went back to do a PhD now, I would handle it very differently, and I'd probably do a lot better. So potentially some of that I'm not sure I want to be a lecturer, I'm not sure this is the right route for me, could have stemmed from that lack of confidence part.
Mm.
But ultimately, I think I'd made the right choice. I don't think I would still enjoy being a lecturer.
Right.
Um, but off the back of that, I fell into the world of L&D. I ended up as a script writer for a bespoke e-learning company,
Okay.
and my eyes kind of opened to where the industry was and well, the industry in general. E-learning hadn't really never thought about it that much before, which
Yeah.
is weird because whilst I was doing my PhD, I was also running seminars and lectures, and as part of that, the digital experience was all run by a Moodle, and I was responsible for that element of those
Okay.
courses. So without really knowing that I was part of this digital community, which I guess tells you a lot about the way that L&D might be run within a university,
Yeah, absolutely.
um, yeah, I had kind of quite a lot of experience around it, which is interesting. But yeah, I kind of fell in accidentally, and I think that's where maybe some of those feelings of what am I doing? Am I good enough? Do I have the right skills? Because of that lack of qualification coming from quite an academic background,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
thinking I need these qualifications, I need to complete these in order to kind of feel like I was doing something correctly. And then being in a field that was utilizing so many of the skills that I developed during my time as a researcher, um, it's funny how you kind of play to that sense of academicness, and actually these are the practical skills that I need to be doing the job, and where that kind of balance is drawn at some points. But yeah, I could carry on talking about kind of my role and my background, but I think there's something maybe quite interesting in that um, conversation around where imposter syndrome comes from. And for me, it definitely came from that lack of an official qualification. And
Yeah.
now, as I mentioned, feeling a lot more secure in myself and my experience, I don't suffer from imposter syndrome as much
Mm.
because I can back up what I'm doing with years of experience now, and that obviously helps in that situation.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and whilst you were saying that, it reminded me of something that potentially, yeah, could do with looking at in feeling out of place when you leave a formal education structure to come into a world where a lot of it is experience based more so than actually qualification based. I've certainly come across plenty of people in our field that have all the qualifications in the world but are still not getting the practical hands-on approach that you need to be a people person that can bring people along a learning journey. Vice versa, I've met some incredible L&D professionals with not a single qualification to their name. But that kind of and it kind of sounded a bit like you were getting to this stage in your formal education as well, where it was becoming the opinions of people rather than the actual, if you hit this you will get this grade and that means that you have done well. It's that kind of that lack of formality and that informality of people's opinions that can suddenly have a rocking effect on, I don't even know if I am doing well or not. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's, something that potentially, and that's why I think if I went back into that environment now and was doing a PhD research now, I
Mm,
would approach it very differently to how I was at the time. There was no kind of, I didn't feel like there was much setup to um, what the expectations were around just how to handle that critical thinking, essentially.
yeah, yeah.
And I think potentially if I'd so I did my bachelor's, I did my master's, and then I had a year out, and then did my PhD. That year out was because I was waiting to hear about funding for my PhD, which I
Right.
eventually secured and managed to do it, or not do it in the end. um, but yeah, I think if in hindsight, I had taken more time and thought more carefully about not only what I wanted from a career, but also what doing a PhD actually was, because it's so different to doing a bachelor's and a master's.
Yeah.
It's almost incomparable, the approach, other than kind of being in the a similar kind of subject area and utilizing kind of similar research methods.
Yeah.
What you're actually doing is very different, and you are thinking very critically, but also quite subjectively
Mm.
around, in my case, conceptual photography. um and yeah, so there's that lack of, um I guess, setup for what you're actually going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, that I certainly didn't experience. And looking back, I think I could have really done with that extra level of support that isn't just from a tutor talking about the actual research that you're doing, but it's about actually how you do a PhD at a very basic level.
Yeah.
I look back and feel like that was missing. I don't know whether I'm being unfair and my memory's just kind of, I don't know, glossed over that fact, but yeah, it certainly wasn't something that I remember, and it isn't something I certainly remember kind of standing out to me.
And I
So
think
yeah,
it's sorry, you go.
no, it's okay, go on.
I was going to say, I think that word support's really important. I was wondering, when you stepped away from the PhD and into this brand new world of learning and development, um, feeling potentially some of those same feelings of this is brand new and am I meant to be here? Having those first pangs of imposter syndrome in a new world. Was there a support network to help you get past that, or was it something you had to do yourself, or did you find it relatively easy in those early stages?
I'm smiling because I entered this role. It was a very junior role, and in fact, it was the most junior role in the organization, across the organization. And so, whilst I had three degrees, I qualified with an MPhil in the end. I'd had run numerous different digital projects during my PhD. I'd been a researcher. I'd done lecturing. I'd run seminars, and I'd also, had multiple different part-time roles whilst I was doing that.
Yeah.
I actually entered as this most junior position because I needed a job. Basically,
Right.
I needed something, and I loved the sound of what I was going to be getting into. But what I quickly realized was I had a huge amount of skills and knowledge and experience of how people learn and how we should be approaching designing learning, that
Yeah.
actually wasn't being utilized in the role that I had. And
Okay.
I was actually being kept back from um, that critical thinking element about why we're
Mm.
actually doing something and why we're designing something. And I was asking a lot of questions that were a bit above my pay grade
Right.
ultimately, in
Yeah.
that role. And it's quite a strange organization. It was a bit of a baptism of fire. The managing director of that company is a personality, and one that when we talk about what good leadership looks like now in terms of fostering psychological safety and trust and feedback, like, he was just the antithesis of that. And
Right.
so, like, there was that element that didn't sit nicely with me as well, but also the fact that I was actually sat there thinking, I could give so much more to this field, and I could do so much differently than and help the customers to think differently about what we're doing. I was almost being kind of kept in a box, and people were saying, "But you're only a script writer. You've only been in the industry for a month. What do you
Right.
know?" And I kept thinking, well, actually, I know quite a lot. Like, you're just
Mm.
not recognizing that kind of experience I'm bringing to the table. And what I would say is that I wasn't the only one in that situation. Um, the team, and I think there were about 10 of us at the time, all in very similar
Wow.
positions, who had all come from previous employment, not necessarily uh, fresh graduates. So there was this kind of sense of, and I look back and I think, actually, maybe none of us had the amount of confidence we needed in our own skills and abilities to look for a role in L&D that was more suited to our skills and experience, because none of us really knew what it was, or what was going on. Um, and so I'm still friends with a couple of people actually that I one of them really good friends with, and we look back and we just think about the type of people we were when we entered that business, and then that kind of recognition of actually we do have a lot of skills and experience that you're just not listening to, you're not interested in. And I actually started that role on the same day as my good friend, and then we left the same day 5 months later.
Oh,
And
really?
that's that, because that 5 months taught me a huge amount about the industry and about,
Mm.
at the time, bespoke learning design, and kind of what I thought good looked like and what good could be. Um, and so it was a bit of a baptism of fire to the industry. And so without that role, it was quite pivotal to me actually wanting to stay in the industry and actually realize that actually these skills are really useful for what people are looking for. Um, but without that, yeah, I just wouldn't have. I guess it was a happy accident. But yeah, it was like recognizing my own worth essentially. So no, I didn't suffer from that kind of sense of imposter syndrome. It was more the opposite of actually, what are you interested in here? Like, are you interested in my skills and my experience? And yes, I had a lot to learn about the industry, but I also had a lot to give that just wasn't being listened to. So I quickly left that role and ended up working for Thomson Reuters, opposite end of the scale, huge corporation. I think at the time there were 60,000 people globally. I think it's a bit
Wow.
smaller now. And I was in the compliance learning function there. So we actually although we sat within Thomson Reuters, we sold compliance learning solutions to external customers, so banks and finance and insurance, that kind of financial
Right.
services sector. And so again, that was a completely different experience going into the corporate world, because the way that Thomson Reuters did things was obviously very much in line with their values as a business, and that kind of thinking about um, the strategic vision and how we fit into that as like a small team within the wider business. And yeah, it was really interesting, kind of thinking about the business side of the solutions we were creating.
And
And
was
yeah, I
that,
wouldn't have got there without that other role.
yeah, was that another happy accident, or had you had enough time in that first role to say, right, I want to aim at a different area of the world of learning and development, and this role sounds like it may be a different area and may use more of my inherent skills that I have?
Yeah, so at the time, I lived in Nottingham, and this role that I had was in Nottingham. And at the time when I was looking for work, you were restricted to local areas. So it was Nottingham,
Of
Derby,
course.
Leicester, that kind of area when I was looking, living in the East Midlands.
Mm.
And so I saw this role advertised. There were also a couple of kind of other well-known businesses that existed. In fact, MindClick were one of them, who Thrive were ultimately made out from. But there weren't. I don't think there was a role at the time there that I really was that attracted to. And
Mm.
so I saw this role of instructional designer advertised with Thomson Reuters, and thought, I really want to. I think that's really up my street. Um, but it was a kind of a happy accident in that it happened to be local, and I would never have gone out of my way to like think, oh, actually, I really want to work for a business like Thomson Reuters.
Right.
In fact, looking back now, I think like, wow, I was pretty ballsy to apply for that role, because
Yeah.
it's such a huge business. It's a bit like applying for a job at PwC in my mind. That it's probably
Yeah.
slightly, but like it would be so competitive. There'll be so many applications. Like that sort of stuff just never crossed my mind, because I didn't really know who they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, and made it through, and really got on with the hiring manager and the operational director at the time. And yeah, so had a lot of really positive conversations during that interview process. But actually, I feel like I was a bit of a um, at the time, a rare talent within the East Midlands, because they were looking for someone within that location. So
Yeah.
yeah, really interesting kind of, yeah, I think it probably was a bit of a happy look, I guess, that like the worlds collided there,
Yeah.
and he bought me that role. And I stayed with Thomson Reuters for about 3 years after that, because
Okay.
they were a great employer,
Yeah.
um, and a lot of really good management and people managers, which makes you stay in a role for longer,
Yeah.
right? If someone's able to manage you properly and provide feedback and progression as well. I was fortunate to be promoted to senior instructional designer there and being involved in some really kind of unique projects. And
Nice.
the reason I left that role was because of the lack of, again, similar to my first role, there was a lack of ability to bring that creativity into what we're doing. So thinking, actually, is a compliance learning solution, e-learning solution, what you actually need here? But then there's kind of a commercial question then of, well, we can't really say it's not the solution because that's what we sell. And
Yeah.
if I start pushing back too much and saying, not sure, you want this compliance e-learning, they're not going to get a sale at the end of the day. And so I have grappled with those kind of moral dilemmas throughout my role, like different roles in various vendors. And it ultimately becomes the point at which I end up leaving. If I can't settle the fact that ultimately people are selling something that someone doesn't need,
Sure.
that's when it becomes an issue for me. So
Yeah.
it's why I'm so happy working at Thrive, because we're so hot on making sure that our product is ultimately the best fit for the customer, because it's better for everyone. We don't want a bad fit customer. They don't want a bad fit product. It makes sense, but there's a lot of sales teams that I've worked with in the past who just want to make a sale, and it doesn't, they don't want someone that's asking the deeper questions and challenging customers to think differently about what they're doing, because they're not going to make the sale at the end of the day. So it's been an interesting polarity to have to deal with.
And it sounds like that in both your jumps from job to job, your progression, it sounds like that somewhere you've wanted more control in being able to actually adapt things to potentially fit things better. Is that something that you feel you've increased your confidence in as you've got to know things more, or is it just something inherently in you that's been there from the beginning that you can see how you just want to be able to kind of be in control a bit more of the creative side of things?
Yeah, I think it's more just knowing kind of I've always been interested in the detail of things. So, and I've always been passionate about understanding what's going on in the industry. As soon as I entered it, it just felt like the floodgates had opened, and I had access to all this information, ideas, people, and I really kind of became part of a community at first, kind of, I guess, more silently than I am now. But I was able to relay the opinions I'd formed from my own projects I'd been working on, or teaching people at various different stages, or while long time prior to higher education, I was actually a before and after school key worker, so worked with very young children. So I had this idea of like what good learning looked like and why we did things in a certain way, that I just never quite managed to find in those roles. So I think it was that kind of, there's like almost something innately within me that makes me want to dig deeper and think about, actually, what are we doing here and what are we trying to solve for our customers? But alongside that, I think it becomes part of what you do, and then you want others to kind of come along with you and think about that as well. And obviously, if you don't have that within your roles, that becomes more of an issue. But I think it's probably more innately within me that I want to approach things in that way, than anything else.
I think so I can't help but connecting it to my own story, only in as much of the fact that just talking to you for this brief time, you can feel the passion that you have around that. Why and how do we get people to come along a learning journey? And I know for a fact that that passion in this learning and development field is something that I've had from the beginning. And since getting into it, I don't think that I've ever wanted to step away from it. I have wanted to work towards areas that are of interest to me. But, and this is the whole point of me doing this podcast, that time and time again, I get to a place where I feel like I can't take that next leap because either other people are already doing the things that I'm really interested in, and I don't want to be one of those hacks that just pick up somebody else's kind of words and say it in a different way to hopefully get traction. We see a lot of those on LinkedIn. And the other thing is, I don't necessarily, yeah, it's very difficult in this learning and development world to really feel like having the data kind of to back up the ideas that you inherently have, to really make you feel like you're adding something that is real and genuine and will help people, instead of just whatever the buzzwords are of the day, and how you could potentially make a couple of bucks from doing that. So I was just wondering, do you feel like, because again, from the outside looking in, it feels like you're now in a position where you are getting to talk about your true feelings, your true approach, and have the data and experience kind of back up that true approach. Is that fair to say, or is that not
Yeah,
always
and
the
I
case?
think there's a few things in what you've just said there. There's something
Mm,
around the curiosity that I find in a lot of people within this industry to just want to know more and do more and be more. And then there's the kind of the piece around authenticity that,
mm,
are you actually what are you actually saying and doing that is true to yourself and the way that you want to be, and to push the industry in the right direction. So it's like kind of extending the ideas of other people and approaching it in the way that you want to. Um, and I think that is, like you say, it can be an element of a problem if people are just regurgitating the ideas of others and not really adding much value outside of that too.
yeah.
But yeah, I think the authenticity piece is a big one, because and it's something I feel very passionate about, just from the kind of the people that I'm interested in and that I follow. I talk about Brené Brown and her work on vulnerability a
Yes.
lot, and alongside that, there is this idea of being what your authentic self, essentially. And I do find it hard to talk about this idea of bringing your authentic self to work and like showing up as your whole self, because whilst I believe that is true, there's also a time and a place for certain ways of communicating and certain ways of being within the workplace that actually counteract that idea of you can just be yourself at any time, because in some situations you need to be more reserved, you need to
Hmm.
be more calculated in the way that you approach things. You need to think about how you're communicating and your tone of voice more in certain situations. But I think ultimately what is important is this idea of fostering psychological safety for people. I know I mentioned it previously, but no matter what you're doing, as long as you're um, if you're being authentic in the way that you approach things and not kind of misguiding people or misguiding others as to who you are as an individual, you can foster that psychological safety much more easily, I think. Um, but yeah, I think so. I think there's something in that around the idea of this curiosity that we find, the passion that we find within the industry, and then people who are then really authentic in the way that they're thinking about problems that the wider industry have, and how they communicate that, and how they turn up to challenge that as well, which
Yeah.
I think is I see quite a lot, which I'm fortunate, I think, to see quite a lot as well in this space.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think it's interesting because I mean, it'd be great to delve a bit into how you came to creating and supporting Women In, because I know that, talking about psychological safety, I mean, there's so much work that we have to do, especially for the female community, not just in L&D, but across the whole of this patriotic world we live in. So yeah, patriarchal world, sorry, we live in. So I was wondering what was the journey that led you to doing that, and if you could talk a bit around what it is and what you're hoping it will do and what it's already doing.
Yeah, so I, fortunately, within my role, end up having a lot of conversations with people and making connections with people across the industry, sometimes through my job, but also through my natural curiosity to connect with people in the wider L&D and HR worlds. Um, and so I'd been having kind of regular conversations with people in various different organizations, vendor side, internal L&D, various size teams. So it could be individuals just working by themselves, kind of one person bands, or bigger, larger corporations where the L&D team is either a global function or part of a global setup. And the messages I was hearing from these people were all the same of, I don't really know what best practice looks like. I don't have anyone to connect with. I'm returning from maternity leave and feeling a bit like I don't really know what good looks like anymore. I don't know who to turn to, who to look to. And it's okay bouncing ideas off the team that I have, but really, are we just kind of within our own little bubble, and what does good actually look like in that wider industry? And so I started to kind of get this idea of, people need a space to connect. And I think actually, coincidentally, these conversations had all been with women that had all kind of started sharing this quite openly once we'd started talking. And there's something in that around, I think, the way that I communicate and the way that I'm able to create psychologically safe spaces for people to share that sort of stuff in the first place, which I'm very glad about. But then, that there is this kind of there was this wider feeling that something needed to happen, and people didn't really know what, and people didn't really know where to turn to. So I thought, well, I want to create something. I just didn't really know what it was. And my tendency is to want to create something perfect first time, and like put all the thought and the effort into the, how are we going to do this and what are we going to do, without just saying, actually, let's just give it a go and see what happens. So I spent quite a lengthy period of time, I'm going to say probably about 6 months, thinking, I don't really know what I want to do. I know that I want to do something. It could be this, it could be that. And ultimately, in the end, I just thought, I'm just going to have to double check my thinking here, that I've seen this pattern emerging, that people actually want this space to connect. And so I created a WhatsApp group in the end, and said, I'm just bringing people together, and bringing women and people who identify as women together to just to share ideas, essentially, and to learn from each other, and to seek advice. And within the first, I would say, week, we had about 100 people on the group. And now there's, I haven't actually checked recently, but there's probably about 300 people. We also have our platform that's run through Thrive, which we run events through. I think there's ultimately about 450, 500 people that are registered on the platform. And it just keeps kind of evolving as we go. So what we're finding there again is that people are coming to the group and seeking advice, and people are giving it so freely without an expectation of anything in return. And that's the joy for me in creating this group, is that people are coming and saying, actually, I'm developing a leadership program. What does good look like? What should I be thinking about? I'm thinking about XYZ. Is this the right thing to do? And people are like, here's my experience. Here's what I do. Or like, can you recommend anyone for this particular project? And people are just sharing, and we have genuinely created a safe space for people to come and say, actually, I'm not sure I agree with this, or how would I approach this conversation, or how do I do things differently? And I think there's potentially an element in like LinkedIn, for example. Yes, it's brilliant for networking and for sharing ideas, but actually, how good it at enabling people to be a bit more vulnerable, and to say, actually, I'm not sure that I'm doing this to the best of my capability, or is there a way of doing things differently? Because that, it puts you in a really vulnerable position doing that on LinkedIn, and arguably, like, maybe LinkedIn isn't the place to be doing it. But so I think we've taken away that anxiety of sharing, because people know it's a safe community to do that. And the feedback we get all the time is just so positive about the space. And I'm part of multiple different groups, and there's never a constant flow of communication as there is on Women In.
Right.
Really fortunate. I don't know what magic it is. I'd love to be able to bottle it and share it, say, here, go and do this. And the thing that I was really keen on was creating this idea of bringing people together to share and to learn, like I said, but for then it to ultimately to expand, and people to kind of go off and make kind of subgroups that they've like connected through Women In, but actually now we're going over here and we're going to continue this conversation elsewhere, because it just makes sense practically. And that has started to happen. And we've seen, so the WhatsApp group turned into a WhatsApp community, and there are now separate spaces on there for coaching, for job opportunities, for events. There's a group focused on neurodivergence now as well, and kind of how people kind of approach that within the workplace, or have lived experience and can share that as well. And that's just so amazing to see, is that people want to do that and they want to set this up and they want to continue the conversation. And we released some feedback forms a few months ago, and the general feedback was obviously very positive, but it was also actually we really want to connect face to face. We want to have more events. We want to create that space to meet other people in person, which is, and then it becomes a little bit trickier as a, you know, as a community. Like, how do you I guess financially do that, because it, you know, putting on face-to-face events comes at a cost, and
Yeah.
Thrive have been hugely supportive and have sponsored. We did our first Women in face-to-face event at Learning Technologies, which was amazing. And we're doing an event actually this week on Wednesday, on the 13th of September down in London, where it was an idea sparked by the women in community, but it's open to anyone to come. So it's not just for the women in community, it's for the wider L&D community,
Oh,
about basically
wow.
what does good look like for learning, and how do we create the right environments for people to learn in. And again, Thrive have sponsored that, thankfully. But we're going to think about like hubs of regional meetups and doing something. I think like it would be great. I've been speaking to Fiona McBride about the forgotten what they're called now, the learning meetups that they do, and how we that's really bad advertising, isn't it? How we can create those kind of a crossover, and I still can't remember the name. Like learning and development meetups,
Yeah.
co-working meetups, essentially.
Yeah.
It's got a really catchy title that my brain just obviously doesn't want to
just doesn't want to
pick
remember at
out.
the moment.
Yeah. So yeah, there's lots on the horizon, but ultimately the idea is that we're just creating that safe space. People can share, people can connect with each other, and they can find something in it that might spark a conversation that they take elsewhere and do something externally, because ultimately that's the aim, is to just create that connection between people in the industry.
I mean, it's an incredible story of how you got there. And I mean, I've been part of many, many WhatsApp groups and other groups which have just fizzled and gone. And I think the fact that you are so clear on the purpose of this original WhatsApp group seems to have given everybody kind of permission to really be as vulnerable as possible and ask the questions needed. And it appears that that's chimed with more and more people, and it's grown. And it sounds absolutely incredible where you've got to and where it's going to go in the future. As you say, we've all tried to create these communities, and a lot of the time they might start well and just fizzle out, or something doesn't work, or it just doesn't seem to grow like you want it to. Other people don't get involved, and it's all one person doing everything. So the fact that you've got there is it's absolutely fantastic to hear. The other thing that came to mind is thinking back to the times that I felt most fraudulent or most lost or most like questioning of my own abilities and where it is I think I should go. If I think back to it, it tends to be the times that I felt most alone within my community and haven't felt like, as you say, I've got an outlet to actually say, do you know what? I'm having one of those months where I think every single thing I think or know is absolute rubbish, and I just don't know where my North Star is at the moment. So the fact that you've created a place where people can go and say that, and say, I'm struggling with this, or I've never done this before, or we've tried this and it hasn't worked. So what are other people's experiences? Sounds like a fantastic way to hopefully help lots of people pass those darker days when they are doubting themselves and what it is they do.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm conscious that as the group continues to grow, because ultimately I think that is the goal, is to connect as many people, women, together across L&D and HR and beyond higher education. We have quite a lot of people who are transitioning into L&D who've joined the group, but ultimately it is to create that, you know, safe space to be that vulnerable, like we've just said. But
Yeah.
my worry is, as the group gets bigger, how you can retain that feeling of it being a safe space, because the larger it gets, the more anonymous you become, which has benefits, but also, could that potentially cause a lack of psychological safety ultimately in the day? They're questions that I constantly think about. But yeah, and I would hope that people, if they were feeling like that, would know that they would find the reassurance and the kind of the coaching, I guess. I think because I think coaching comes into a lot of the conversations that we have a lot of the day. In fact, there's a coaching branch that's that happened as a result of these people like extending the community themselves. But it's that, like, how's that making you, like, just asking coaching questions essentially to bring out the answers that people probably already have in themselves, but just need that element of reassurance to get there. And I really hope people do come to the group for that and continue to do that. But the part of that is role modeling as well, right? So the people who are, constantly communicating on the group, because there are a lot of regular contributors. There are a lot of people who aren't regular contributors who just kind of pop up and be like, I am here, but I've got this problem now I really need some help with. So it is role modeling that and saying, I'm feeling like this. Can anyone help? Or does anyone have any experience of this? So I think that has to continue as well.
And have you found that you personally have you had the situation where you felt like you're not sure who to talk to when it comes to something in L&D and not feeling potentially fraudulent in moments? Have you always had a good network around you naturally, or have you just believed in yourself enough that it isn't something that's really shown itself too often?
Yeah, I think I've been quite fortunate with the network that I've had around me, but at the same time, there have definitely been moments where I think, what am I doing? Like, what, like, am I qualified to do this? And I guess, like, when you step in, so I stepped into the role of CLO at the beginning of the year, and that was hugely exciting because this type of role doesn't exist in other vendor space, in the vendor space. In fact, it doesn't really exist anywhere. It's because it's not a traditional CLO role. So we've taken a bit of a risk with the role, because how do you measure the success in a role like this when it hasn't necessarily been done before? And
Yeah.
whilst that's hugely exciting, it's also really nerve-wracking, because you're constantly feeling like, actually, am I doing what I should be? Like, are the expectations on me, am I meeting expectation? And the answer to those questions has been a resounding yes throughout this year. But it's still that kind of, like, I speak to one of the co-founders regularly around this, is I constantly feel like I'm not doing enough. And whilst I'll speak to someone and they'll be like, how do you have the energy to do as much as you do? And that it's so funny how those two things just completely contradict each other. And I have to really make myself, actually, last week, for example, I co-ran an event in London, one of the first face-to-face roundtables that we'd run. I recorded podcast episodes. I was the guest on a podcast. I ran a webinar for learning technologies, and but constantly was thinking, I'm not doing enough. And I
Wow.
really had to make myself stop and be like, actually, I am doing a lot. But I think it's the stuff that, so I'm writing a couple of white papers at the moment and doing the research and the stuff that really requires time and space to kind of get your head into something. And it's those elements that are affected by the event stuff and the kind of the being a voice in the industry, and like putting like what good learning looks like out there into the industry, that have a detrimental impact on the ability to do the more in-depth research. And I feel
Right.
like I've got a real sense of pride and attachment to being able to do that and to carry it off, that I haven't yet done. So it definitely stems from that, and I know it
Yeah.
does, but it doesn't help me kind of stop those thoughts, which is really interesting. But again, leaning into a network and talking about those feelings, I think is really helpful, and just
Yeah.
trying to, I guess, stop my mind worrying as much as it does.
And I'm guessing the constant communication with the co-founders got to help with that as well. If they've got a different perspective to yours, that's got to be some really valuable feedback for that. Well, they believe I'm going in the right direction, so I can use that to kind of quell my natural. I'm not doing everything all at once.
Yeah, it is, and I've actually got a really interesting, I think, relationship with both the co-founders. So I report into Sean, who's our CEO, and we talk quite regularly about what the role looks like and what it should be looking like, and we have very kind of positive conversations, and we are able to challenge each other if we need to. And then Mark, our other co-founder, who is the kind of the product and tech side of the business, is we have very different conversations about what good learning looks like and how we communicate that in terms of our product and its position within the market. So there's two kind of like different sides of perspectives and approaches, and kind of the sales and leadership perspective coming from one side, and the tech and the product conversation and what good learning looks like from the other. And being able, I'm such a fortunate position to be able to kind of bring those two together in my role, and think about, actually, this is what we need to be doing, and this is where we need to be focusing some attention. So yeah, again, just feel really fortunate to be doing this role, and being able to communicate across our business and then externally about what good learning looks like. And there's one of your cats turned up.
Yeah, yeah.
You
Always
knew
got
it
to
was going
pop
to happen.
in. Yeah, it's going to happen at some point. Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I think it's wonderful to hear, because again, to me, just listening to you, it seems like you are in that position where you get to kind of have a hand in both worlds. Like everything that you've built up to, you're getting to have more control over what it is people need and how you can actually help that, along with still being able to be curious and looking at what's next and where the whole world of development goes. So I mean, I can imagine that it's one of those rare positions where you wake up excited way more than you wake up trepidatious, and that's fantastic to hear.
Yeah,
um
it definitely is, and it's with I think I would say the foresight of Sean, our CEO, who kind of knew this role in the business would come up eventually. We just didn't really know when, or when the right time was going to be. And I'm just glad I was here when the role came up. Although, obviously, if I'd seen it advertised, I would have applied for it. But
yeah.
I'm just glad that they had the faith in me. So I was previously in the role of head of learning here, for the business, and they saw what the good work I was pushing for, but completely different role to what I'm in now. But yeah, just really glad that Sean had that kind of foresight, and obviously has done for a lot of the stuff that we do generally as a product. So yeah, it's a great place to be.
I'd love to, before we finish, because I know we've been talking for nearly an hour already, but obviously the first time that I became aware of you was through Diary of a CLO, which is a fantastic podcast. And I don't know how British you are about compliments to your face, but yeah, I think it's been absolutely fascinating, and it's up there with one of my top L&D podcasts. And I think the reason is because of the variety of guests that you have, like from Frank Smith to Sally Gunnell to people that are really working in the industry each and every day. And it's just such a vast array of approaches to lots of different elements. And yeah, so I'm really enjoying that. And I was wondering, because one of the questions that came to me when I reached out to you was, how do you get your head in a place? Because that seems like something quite new. Talking to all these diverse people, some of which have MBs, OBEs, I don't know, everything and anything. I would feel incredibly intimidated and out of place to interview these people. So I was wondering if that is something that you felt, and how you approach this kind of new project.
Yeah, so I've never done podcasting before.
Right.
I naturally quite like having conversations with people. I'm curious. I ask not the right questions. I ask questions,
Yeah.
and like challenge people's ideas, and also like to encourage people to continue digging into ideas as well once they get started. So yeah, it was completely new to me. So when I first started recording, I was more intimidated. I was more worried about the tech setup and doing things properly and making sure I recorded properly. And that I think when I listen back to some of my earlier conversations, I think, oh, I would have approached that differently. I think maybe I would have asked the questions with more confidence. So I mean, it's how people always look back at their own work and think, oh, I would
Yeah.
have done that differently. But it's a learning curve as well. At the end of the day, it was a bit of a gamble. We didn't really know how it was going to, like, whether it was going to be well received. The idea was always that we were going to bring people from both in the industry and outside the industry together to think about some core ideas. Leadership has often been one of the things, but then learning from kind of failure, and mental health and well-being, that those kind of themes come out a lot in the conversations that we end up talking about. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I often just think these are they're just human beings. They have conversations with other people every single day of their lives, and ultimately they want to be talking about the work that they're doing. And so if I'm giving them a space and a platform to be able to do that, then that's a real positive for them. And so like we do spend kind of 10 minutes at the beginning of episodes just you know, I guess sense checking the direction and the tone, and sometimes we've just jumped straight into it. There's been a couple of conversations where we've just gone, right, just hit record, we're going to get into it, and we just have a conversation. But there's an element of setup there, and like, this is what we want to talk about, this is what we want to cover, are you comfortable with that? And giving people the space to say, actually, I wasn't okay with that, can we edit that out, or can we rethink that? But yeah, I think that the most intimidated I've been, I was actually quite intimidated when I recorded Dan Murray Serta's episode, because he was I think it was one of the second episodes I'd ever recorded. I don't know, I don't think it was the second episode we released. It might have been. I think it was actually.
Yeah.
And so he's a well-known podcaster. He runs Secret Leaders podcast, one of the UK's top performing podcasts. Also is an entrepreneur and runs his own business, and just really, to me, was a really interesting person. I was just like, wow, I'm about to interview this guy, and
Yeah.
I really want to do a good job. So I remember feeling quite nervous at that point. But then ultimately you just have to do it. Like you just have to get on with it and do as best as you can in that situation. That's one of the things, like, you've only got a set amount of time to do it, so you just need to get the job done, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's how I combat, I think, those nerves. But the most nervous I've ever felt was when we recorded Diary of a CLO live with Stuart Broad at our customer event.
Yes.
First
Yeah.
of all, never recorded a podcast live before in my life. I'd never met a famous person before. Stuart Broad, obviously one of the most well-known cricketers in the
Yeah,
world.
absolutely.
And having to do it live in front of 250 people was very intimidating in itself as well. So I just have this ability to be like, I've just got to get on with it. I've just got to do the best I can, and kind of and just switch off from the nerves as much as possible.
Yeah.
And unfortunately that went really well. But it's just taking that moment to say, actually, just got to do your best in this situation. And with I guess that idea of, I'm always going to look back, no matter what, no matter how well I do, and think I could have done that differently, or I could have been better in this moment. So I try and keep that in mind as well, that nothing's ever perfect, and I've just got to get the job done, essentially.
I love that, and I think that's a really nice way for us to wrap this up. Looking back, getting the job done, having a psychologically safe environment, and having a network around you where you can ask questions. I think there's been some great insight into how to make sure that when you feel like a fraud, you know that you're not. So thank you so much for your time today, Helen.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you once again to Helen for giving up her time and having a discussion with us today about when she's felt like a fraud and when she's got past it. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think what I took away from it, I took a lot away from it, but one of the main things I took away from it is that if you are truly passionate about what it is you're doing, and you listen to what that passion is telling you, then it can get you to do things despite the fact that you may feel fraudulent when first thinking about doing them, whether that's changing your career, stepping out of full-time education to start on a professional route, interviewing guests on a podcast, anything and everything. If you've got something inside of you that is telling you that you want to do it and you believe that there's worth in doing it, then that can potentially push you forward past those fraudulent limiting beliefs that we can sometimes give ourselves. I really hope we get to speak to Helen again in the future, because I feel like we could have taken single aspects of her journey and really deep dived on them, and hopefully we'll do that in the future. Thank you again, Helen, and thank you every one of you that have watched this week. If you have found this interesting and you think it is worth sharing, then please do. It will really help me to get this podcast into the hands of people that potentially need it the most. I started this podcast because I wanted to talk about my own limiting beliefs, my own fraudulent feelings, and talking to these people has really helped me push past that. If there are other people that can do the same too, then please share it with them. Also subscribe wherever you subscribe to podcasts. That really help, and it'll mean that when the next episode drops, you'll be there. Finally, this is the worst that I should be. Please feel free to give me feedback any way you want to. Completely open to it, and I'm just looking to be a better and better interviewer to get the most out of these conversations I'm having with these brilliant people. Other than that, we'll see you next week. I'm Adam House, and I'm a fraud.